this is fantasy literature. I'm going to do a few housekeeping, and then we are going to turn the panel over to our fabulous panelists. So we are supporting the Cure Childhood Cancer this year. It's an amazing charity. Then we have the charity bucket up here. We also have the charity coloring books. Little known mystery fact, there were less than 50 of the volume 2 at DragonCon this morning, 45 to be exact, 43 of which were in this room. There are no longer 43 in this room. So when this book sells out, it is gone, ladies and gents. So, $10, color long time. We even have crowns for our charity color on Saturday night. That starts at 11, right? It's the last panel we have on Saturday night. We'll have crowns available and people can come and color, play Are You a Werewolf, and have fun. When we get to the point of asking questions, I'm going to ask that you guys come up here and speak into the mic, speak clearly, because it'll make the audio engineer who helps me re-edit these panels so much happier, because otherwise we spend way too long trying to adjust levels. Now, on with the show.
Alrighty. Okay, so we're going to be going over histories, we're going to go over conspiracies, we're going to go over some fantasy, and we're going to have some fun, I hope. Anyway, so here are our lovely panelists. We're going to start from this end, we're going to go down that end. Would you love to introduce yourselves, please?
Certainly. My name is Quincy J. Allen. Bill myself is a cross-genre author. I've written fantasy with Marc and Edelheit. I've written sci-fi with Kevin Eikenberry. I've done some solo stuff in steampunk and sci-fi noir. So I'm kind of all over the board. I've got short fiction all over the place.
Hi, I'm Tamsin Silver, and I am an author with Falstaff Books, and I write both historical fantasy and urban fantasy.
I'm Howard Andrew Jones. I just started working for Baen recently. This is my new book with them, just a couple of weeks old, and it's inspired by Hannibal of Carthage and his adventures. And before that, I was working at St. Martin's, and it was also, that was more straight historical fantasy there. This is secondary world.
My name is Marc Allen Edelheit, and when Quincy over there said fantasy, he means erotica.
I confuse those. It's weird.
No, I write military science fiction and fantasy and high fantasy, and I've been published for a little over about 8 years now. And we're about to break the 3.5 million books sold mark, which is pretty crazy. I did it just to see if I could do it, and the first book took off, and haven't looked back since. I have 25 novels out right now, and I've got another one coming out next month, and then I'm working on 4 currently at the same time, and it's been just absolute blast. I know a lot of people here got books. We brought 2,000 books to give away. As I've told multiple people, I'm like a drug dealer. First one's on me, the rest are on you. We're going to be at the Fantasy Gather tonight, and we're going to be bringing a lot of books with us. So if you're going to go, if you've never been to the Fantasy Gather, I recommend it. You get to meet a lot of authors there.
And not all of us are giving away that many books. just so you don't walk up and go, hey, you got free shit.
Yes, so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Alrighty, well, we're here, we're talking about history. What I'd like to ask is, what's your favorite historical period and region? And we'll start off this end again, and we'll go down there.
Well, just as a fascination for me, I would say the era of samurai in Japan. I haven't really delved into it as a study, but I love everything about it. So yeah, that's certainly mine.
I want to see you make a samurai sword.
Ooh.
That's coming.
Layered.
I am my section of time that I really study a lot of is the Old West, specifically New Mexico history. The series is around the 1878 to 1881 and on, and then also the 1940s, and the similarities that happen in history there in New Mexico with all of the crooked politicians. I know, shocking, and the crooked lawmen. I know. But it is the Santa Fe Ring, and it's an interesting time period over there. Is that I like the idea of it being the territory, and watching how it became a state, and all of the painful pieces that made that happen. the growing pains for New Mexico were harsh.
I'm a huge fan of anything ancient Mediterranean. So, the Roman Republic, but further back, ancient Egypt, and then of course also into the Fertile Crescent and the Indus Valley civilization is fascinating. That just so much great material and ideas there to work with, all those.
Yeah. So my fascination is ancient Rome, and what I did without realizing what I was doing at the time when I wrote Tigers, was I married basically epic fantasy with Roman legion technology. A lot of people write fantasy in the medieval period of time, and we know a lot about ancient Rome, how they lived, how they fought, and it was a lot of fun. Can I continue on the conspiracy thing?
Yes,
Okay,
yeah, go
absolutely.
for it.
So I created this whole world, this whole universe, and I have multiple storylines set in the same universe and all linked to each other. And I wrote the Tigers series first before I wrote the Kara Saga, and the Kara Saga is about one of history's greatest mysteries, which is what happened to the 9th Roman Legion. One day it was guarding Rome's northern border in Britannia around 120 to 122 AD, and the next day it was gone. And there are a lot of theories, nobody knows what happened to it. So what I ended up doing was I took it, I abducted the entire Legion and brought it to a fantasy world. And the month before it published, Doctor Who came out with an episode on the 9th Roman Legion, and I was like, no! But it's really captivated a lot of people because you take this great mystery and you take Roman legionaries, and they believed in all these different gods, and they believed in dragons. They have reports of Roman legates, the equivalent of a general leading a legion, saying, hey, I couldn't accomplish my objective because there was a dragon there. They actually have letters that say this. So when you take them to a fantasy world, it's a lot of fun because for them it's like, oh, the gods did this, and they adjust to it. So there's a lot you can do playing with history and fantasy, and it's just an absolute blast, and it's a playground. And I got to meet George Lucas once, and I'll finish quick so the others can go. But I was talking to him, and he was like, I created this wonderful world, but I can't go play in it, and I feel the same way. So it's kind of sad at the same time, but
So with history, and it's such a subject matter, which is it's juicy, and you go down the rabbit hole, and 3 hours later you're like, I should probably go write. What are those things where you've gone down that rabbit hole and it's actually changed the way that you're writing, or it's really influenced the way you're writing because you have learned something new out of that historical text or those events? Like what's those crystallization moments where it's like the story meets this piece of information so well and it's like just perfect. Well, start down that end and come back this way.
God. There's so much. I have so many research books, and I just it's easy to go down the rabbit hole. Like right now, I'm reading the Time Life book series on the American Indian because there's so much in their culture that is so rich and can be used in a fantasy world. It's amazing, and there's so much in there that I didn't know. But what usually gets me is when I think I know something about a subject, and then a fan reaches out and says, "Hey, you're wrong here." And then you have to go research it. And I'll give you a perfect example. I had a Harvard professor reach out to me and go ahead and said, Mark, I really love your books. I've read, at the time I had 4 books out. I've read all 4 of your books. But it really drives me nuts when you say he waited a few seconds. Because the Romans didn't have any way to measure seconds. They had minutes and they had hours, but they had no seconds. And I was like, shit. And I had to go research it. And I researched it, and she was right, so I had to go back and change everything. And now it's like he waited a few heartbeats, or he counted, that kind of stuff.
No, I can relate to that. I mean, I guess those are the sorts of things that trip up anyone who's writing totally historical stuff. As far as life-changing, so when I was 16 or so, I read a biography of Hannibal of Carthage by Harold Land. And I just found the character of this man so fascinating and so much more interesting than the high school version. Oh yeah, he crossed the Alps, he was trying to conquer Rome. and seeing the wider understanding of it. Well, was he actually trying to conquer like all these other ancient generals, or was he basically just trying to bring Rome to a standstill because he knew that they were going to conquer his people? He was afraid that they were going to destroy his people. Another way to look at it, he's a patriot, because sure enough, 50 years after his death, they completely exterminated his civilization, right? They sowed the ground with salt, sold everyone left into slavery.
That's how you know you're really unhappy with somebody. It's when you take fertile ground in North Africa, where they grew a lot of crops, and you just take 2 legions and you pour salt over the fields.
And they ended up regretting at least the sowing of salt, because they came back later and
Bit 'em in the ass.
refounded Carthage on their own. But anyway, what I didn't realize when I was 16 is when I became fascinated and kept reading more and more stuff is that, at some point in my 40s, I would begin to write stories based upon this character. So it was life-changing. I just found it fascinating.
And politics ruined Hannibal.
Oh, yeah.
Because he could have succeeded.
If he had better backing from the people,
Reinforcements.
right.
Originally, the series was just going to deal with Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. And at one point, I liked, because I was telling this story, the short story is where this started. And it was, the idea is it was somewhere in the 1900s, and he was looking back, and because of a curse, Billy's still alive in 1949, 1950. And so he is, and I thought it'd be funny. I was like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if like 1949 or something, right before so I don't know how many people here know that Billy the Kid's footstone's been stolen twice. Okay, it's been twice and taken. And that's why he's all in a big cage. And so
It's not that he was a criminal.
No. Oh no.
They never let him out, right?
No, so his footstone is in shackles to keep it there, and then all 3 of them are in a big old cage with bars. It's fitting in a way, and it's sad in another. And I was like, oh, it'd be funny if I wrote something where it was him who stole it. And I was like, so what's in 1949? I had no plans. And all of a sudden, I come across the story of this unsolved murder of this young girl named Ovida Cricket Kugler in Las Cruces in 1949. She was an 18-year-old waitress who was murdered, and it was never solved. And much like Capone stuff, what they did is they couldn't get the person who did this, so they went after other stuff. And it ended up exposing this huge issue with gambling and the Chicago Mafia and how it changed the entire footprint of New Mexico. Her death alone. And the more I dug, the more I was like, who is this girl? What was this? And it took the entire book in another direction, to the point where the entire series became 2 time periods. I went and found her grave. She's actually buried right near Garrett. How strange, right? That she's right there near Pat Garrett. But it changed my entire plan for the series, just learning about her and what happened to her, because all of a sudden I knew I needed to write about that, and people needed to know her story. And her family reached out to me after the book came out, and it changed everything for me with this her. And I visit every time I go to Las Cruces, I visit her grave. So, but it was that moment. It just changed the entire plan of the novel for me.
Oh, for me, it's when I do the rabbit holing in history, it's usually to get a nugget for a story, or to find a piece that will help build out a character. So, and I ended up with finding one. I tell this story a lot. I ended up finding there's a moment in history that set the stage for what ended up will be 2, possibly 3 series for me. I've got the Blood War Chronicles. It's a clockwork gunslinger in a world of magic. So it's alt history, sort of, but it's got magic. So I was rabbit holing, researching Jesuit priests in Germany in like the 1800s and going further back. And then that led me down a rabbit hole to the Inquisition, which led me down to what caused it. So part of the problem with an alt history with magic in the U.S. in that period is, where did all the people come from? Because of the Inquisition and the plague. And where did magic come from? So as it turns out, in this rabbit hole, back in 1226, 3 cardinals got together and nominated and gave us Pope Gregory. Pope Gregory is the one who actually amped up the Inquisition and put a death sentence on cats in Europe. As a result, you then get rid of pretty much the populace with the plague because the cats would have killed the rats. And then the Inquisition was also getting rid of all the witches. And so it was this moment that gave me, like I said, I'm going to get 3 series out of this, a whole ton of short stories. And so it's those little bits where you find means and moments in history to kind of turn them on their edge and make them work for your stories.
Yeah, you know, talking about the cats, Roman legions were very fond of cats, and wherever they went, they brought cats with them. There wasn't a cohort or century that didn't have several cats that they adopted. They viewed them as the hunters, the premier hunters of their, and they compared themselves to them. But really what they did is they protected against disease, because when you're in a tent and there's the big problem with the black rats and you get bit by a black rat, it's like, you know, getting sliced open by a scalpel. Or you have your equipment gnawed upon with the leather. And what ended up happening was the Roman legionaries were responsible for their equipment. So, you know, cats got rid of the vermin and cut down on disease. So the Roman legions are responsible for importing cats all over Europe. Not to mention grapes for the vines, because they make their own wine.
Yeah, and then even like, you know, all the wine was, okay, we need to ferment it, because then we can have clean drinking water, essentially.
Yeah.
Because then it can maintain when we're on long marches, and you know, even the rations and all that kind of stuff. Because I always find it interesting when you look at Romans, is they actually carry the same amount of, well, they're supposed to, and I think this is every military in the world, they carry the same amount of gear from battlefield to battlefield as you do in a modern military, because men can only carry so much for such a long period of time, and then they just go, and you want a radio on top of that? Yeah, we're gonna go do that. But what are like the synergies that you found? Because like when you think about history, you know, it's already in a period of time that we won't get to experience. You have different lenses and different ways of going through that information. Each of you have gone through different paths and like areas of history. When matching that with fantasy, what are the easy parts and what are the difficult parts that you have to do? Because when you're doing it with fantasy, there's sometimes magic systems involved. Then you've got the whole, okay, how are we, like, you know, introducing, how are we going to have magic in here? How are we going to have gunpowder in here? How are we going to have ghosts in here? Those kind of things. What are those hard parts you're having? What are those fun parts you're having? And where did it just work so easily?
That's a big question.
I'm like,
Yeah. So when it comes to my kind of stuff with magic, you have to have limits on it. There has to be, you know, you're going to use magic. There has to be a cost, an expense. With wizards in my world, you know, when they expend great amounts of magic, they age. So they lose their life force. But there's you have to be really careful, because we were talking about the gnomes in my world. They're not your garden variety gnomes. Hess and Tovak, they're like
more like rabid chihuahuas.
Rabid chihuahuas,
That's actually a pretty good analogy with accents.
With what?
And
Explosives.
yes, high
machinery.
explosives. Yeah, so they like the big boom, right? So they're the nuclear option. And like in the you've read up to them.
I've read the first half of the Ellie book.
But fight, Tiger's Fight.
I've read up to Tiger's Fight and Tiger's Imperium and Tiger's Fight. That's the last one.
Yes, Tiger's Fight is the last one. This one's Tiger's Rage. Yeah. So basically, in this book, in Tiger's Fight and the Tiger's Rage, Steiger now has an army of gnomes with him, and they're children of chaos. There's got to be limitations to their use. Otherwise, they just overpower the story. And it's very tricky finding that balance where you can use them. And you saw that when we were working with Tovak with Hess.
Absolutely.
And we only had one gnome in that book. So it's tricky and fine line. And it's something as an author that you really have to walk a tightrope, because if you don't, the reader's going to call you out on it, and they're not going to be happy with it. It won't feel right. Did that answer your question?
Yeah,
or
like
something?
where's it gone easy, where's it gone hard? It's, every gambit of it, right? Because,
Yeah.
sometimes magic systems to match with history, because, history, you're going to have to maintain that kind of constant threat, right? Of, okay, I got to stay true to history in some degree, but I've also got to maybe alter it in some way.
Yeah.
How close do you try to stay with the history of it, and how do you like divert it, or does it like take its own diversions?
For me, it's as close as possible, to the point where I would be like, okay, so did this exist then? Can I even use that in my magic? Because I was very particular with it. My books are almost like secret history compared to like alternate history. And so like when there's an issue, and to find the magic for it, I used, so those of you might know that Billy was Irish, and so was Dolan, and so was Murphy, and so there was a ton of Irishmen out west due to the war. And so I went with Irish folklore, and I found something that said that this person was the leader of the dark realm of the other world, and they were the creator of monsters and heroes. And I was like, okay, that's fascinating. Why? And so I just started writing to find that out and see what it was. But to find that magic system so that it works, I had to really play with it and see. Like for instance, Billy, if he kills a werewolf, he takes that energy into his well of souls, and it heals him. He runs out of those souls by, if he expends it, like even a paper cut will use up some of it, right? So if he runs out, he's kind of in trouble, because all of a sudden then he can be injured. And so he has to start keeping track, and we see what happens when he doesn't keep track of that. Then we had to have something that was actually going to hurt him. But I had to think about what existed and what did they know about at the time, so I used copper. So it's something that nowadays no one would, but back then it was, so it played a lot on me trying to figure out what was around then, what wasn't, what could I use, what couldn't I use. I had to look up and study how much a phone was used for the 1949 section, and I literally wrote this whole thing about using this specific speakerphone when they talked to J. Edgar Hoover. And my editor was like, I said, oh yeah, here, have the history that I found. And they were like, yeah, but no one's going to believe that, and it's going to be hard, so why don't you just turn it into a magical thing instead? I was so mad. I was so flippin' mad. Because I'd done all this research on phones, which is something I never thought I'd say as a child. What did you do? I studied phones all day. And turns out I found out literally 3 days ago that there's an entire museum on the telephone. It's one of the best ones in the country, and it's in Albuquerque.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, I didn't
Okay, that's
figure it out.
fun.
My friends were like, we need to go. Because we're nerds, it's fine.
You can go there and correct them.
Yeah, right? So it is, so in the book when you get to that, I turned it into a magical thing, but originally it was an actual one of the very first speakerphones. So yeah, so there's some play between magic and history.
I wanted to tag in on something Marc was saying about the way you approach the magic in your Roman world. So since I wanted to have my character feel an awful lot like Hannibal of Carthage, even though he's not, this is a secondary world, so he's not the same guy, right? But he's very similar. And so I thought, well, if I want to have him have the same abilities and the same kind of combat awareness, I want to keep magic fairly low. So I deliberately designed it to be more like old sword and sorcery magic, where it's unpredictable, very dangerous. Things are likely to go wrong. So it's not something that you rely on. That way I could make pretty clear that the battles are going to fall fairly similarly to the way they would feel in reading Roman history. But I could still have some magic and some darkness and creepy ghosts, because they couldn't be used in any kind of consistent way. Now, when I was writing my Arabian fantasy stuff, that was set in the real world, except that magic was real, more like urban fantasy or like Sherlock Holmes crossed with the Arabian Nights. And that, I tried to mimic very carefully what was really going on, what was believed, and even had real historical people in the background. And of course, these real historical people would have believed, as Marc was saying, in these the jinn, and these superstitions. And so it's, in some ways, when you're going back to a primary source, having them believe in the magic that they believed in somehow, I find just a little bit easier than
It's a lot easier.
than building
agree.
it up on your own.
So in the Tigers series, the Steiger Chronicles, basically what ends up happening there is that the book opens and magic is like a rare thing. And it's very expensive, like a magic lamp, very expensive to get your hands on. Wizards are far and few between, and in the beginning, it's, you have an idea that it's fantasy because Steiger's companion is an elf, an elven ranger, but it's low magic, and as you get throughout the series, it begins opening up, and Steiger becomes aware of all these things that he didn't know before, and he starts having to encounter, deal with them. Same thing in the Kara saga, and it makes it fun, and you also get to play with. I'm sure you did it with the ancient battles. One of the things nobody that's alive today has seen or knows what an ancient battle was actually like on the battlefield. Okay, the historians that wrote back in the day, they would write it from the perspective of basically, he did this, he went there. They were giving you a big overall picture, but they weren't going into the details of what it was like to stand in a shield wall and fight in a shield wall, because the audience that they were writing to already knew that. So they didn't see. So we know a lot about how ancient Rome trained, how they fought, and they would sit there and go at it. And was it Vegetatus? I can't remember the guy's name. He went ahead and said the only difference between a real battle and training was the effusion of blood. Okay, and they trained hard. So you would think, and you see a lot of Hollywood movies today, that a lot of the killing happens when the two armies come together. So they're bashing against, they're hitting each other. The real killing happens when one army breaks, or their line breaks, and then you're talking doing serial killer shit for the next few hours, trying to run them down. And it's fun from a writer's perspective, not doing a serial killer shit. I want to clarify that one.
Little disclaimer there.
But it's fun doing the research and then bringing that battle, what that was like for the people on the ground, to life for the reader, because the reader is going to learn. They're going to have a new perspective when you're done, and if you do it right and you do it historically accurate, it's going to come off as authentic. And you keep that reader right there, and you know what I'm talking about with this, right? It takes a lot of work to pull that off. And then when Quincy and I were working on it, we were focusing on, we moved away from it, we were focusing on dwarves, and feel free to speak on it, but it's like, well, how did the dwarves fight? So we had to come up with a whole system as to how they fought in battle, and they fought orcs, and it's a whole separate storyline that's linked to the others, and it took a lot of work to pull it off authentically, and I think we did, because the last book is in the series is rated as 4.8 on Amazon, so readers really love that book. They're begging for more. So
We'll get there.
yeah,
We'll get there. For me, the hardest thing that I found on the research side and dealing with history was when, and in opposition to her, I do not adhere to the accuracies. I take ideas and then I fly off the handle. So she's very, I'm not so much.
I just like to make things harder on myself. It's totally fine.
And I
understand.
just make shit up. So really, for that part, finding specific items, moments, people to draw out of history, that becomes a little more difficult. And actually, I came up with a few story prompts. But doing that part, if I need something very specific, it's hard. I mean, you have literally thousands of years to pick from, and continents and cultures and everything else. So, I found ways to zero it in, or this is really what I'm after, and then you go digging. What I did find that came really easy was the story prompts of stuff, these nuggets you find along the way, right? It's like walking along the old, there was a point in Africa's history, it was at the Gold Coast, walking along the beach, you would find is either gold or diamonds. I think it was diamonds, actually. So it was like that, walking along this path I'm on, these little things would pop up. I mean, in researching for this panel, I actually came up with, so Mark, you may not know this, but Mark Twain was born and died with the passage of Halley's Comet. And I thought, is there a cycle there? So I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Who, and you go digging, who was born and died on the years that Halley's Comet along? And actually Wikipedia, which is not the best research source there is, but for this it was ideal.
The internet does not lie.
Exactly, right? Never, not ever. What I found, so as a footnote, I found actually, so prior to Mark Twain, he was a priest here in the U.S., I believe, who was the first to claim to be a Unitarian, which is a very different change from the straight lace that they had up to that point in religion. After Mark Twain, the next cycle was, she was a woman who was a civil rights attorney and an author who helped sort of fight. She joined the ACLU and did all that. And then when she died, this is 85, a young author was born who basically there was a second novel out. She was 26 years old, won awards that nobody else had won. And the question is, so if you have this cycle, if it's the same soul bouncing through, could it be that this one soul has arguably helped usher in what we would call modern day liberalism, at least in the West? Is this young woman destined to die in, I think it's 69? Will she continue on her career following that path, right? So you find these pieces and those start to turn into story ideas. I mean, I could absolutely get a novel out of that. I got another one actually that if we have time I'll read, but we want to keep going.
Yeah, no, with history, you kind of all touched on it. When we read history, it's very far away, right? There's no real, unless it's a biography, and even biographies are usually kind of hazy, is, okay, we're seeing this from, they went to this battle, they won this battle, this was the outcome. Mm-hmm. And then you go into the closeness of, what was that battle like? Was the ground mushy? Were we dealing with hills? Are we having flanking maneuvers? What's going on there? And that's with every piece of information, because the closer you get, the more the characters are not only a real person, but the information starts to come out around them, that it really develops that story. Like, what are some magical moments you've had where you're like seeing these battles or these things in history and it's come alive to you? Because I know for many writers, when you're doing it, you're actually living vicariously in the story, and thus you're essentially living in history. Has there been some of those moments where you've just been like struck by it and you have to take a moment to step back and go, wow, that's really cool, and I've just been teleported back in time?
Do you mean because it was presented so well by what we're studying, or just that?
By what you're studying, and also as you're writing it as well. Because I find sometimes, when you're reading these texts, you can get bits and pieces of information, but it's as you characterize, as you get deeper into that person from all of the source material, that you can start going, wow, this person is crazy, or this person is actually hilarious, and on the outside they might be very stoic, but you start reading their information. Like one would be Marcus Aurelius, when you read his meditations, is like, this is just a person. Yeah. And then you start going like, these are just people too. They're not just what history has made them out to be.
Yeah. So a lot of the Roman writings, like Caesar wrote, and it was, he was patting himself on the back for the mob at home, right? And so like Josephus is a perfect example. He surrendered during the revolt in, I think it was 66 AD. He surrendered to his army to Vespasian, and Vespasian was going to have him put to death, and he went ahead and said, I've had a revelation from God that you will be emperor one day. And Vespasian went ahead and said, I think I'm going to keep this guy around. So he ended up becoming the historian for Vespasian, and he wrote it with the Roman, tilt, where it's like, hey, these guys aren't so bad. So there's all kinds of really cool stuff. But to answer your question about what got me, was I was doing the research on the 9th Roman Legion, and we know who commanded it, who the senior tribunes were. We know some of the people that were in the ranks, because the Romans kept records of all this. They had a high command back in Rome, and they sent reports back and forth. So the first part of the Kara saga was half historical fiction and half fantasy. They have historical fiction. How did they get from, their garrison at Eboracum, which is modern day York, to the world tennis? And so I had to go through that whole process. And I did a lot of research on it. And one of the things that I found was that there was a senior tribune who was basically technically the second in command. He was in training to be a legate, which we call today a general. And he had a 22 or 25-year hiatus in his career. Now, for a Roman noble to have a hiatus in your career that long before you got another public appointment was a big deal. And I started looking into it. And what a number of historians believe today was that there was a military disaster and the 9th Roman Legion was wiped out. There are other theories as well, but this is possibly quite probably what actually happened. And Saturninus, who was the senior tribune, he survived. And whether he was taken prisoner or not, and then ransomed back to Rome, nobody knows. But there was like a and I write about this in the back of the book, a historical note. There was like a 20-year gap, 22, 25, before he got another appointment. Basically, he had to wait till there was a new regime in power, a new emperor, to get a job. And shortly after the 9th disappeared, Hadrian built his wall. So they think that there's the possibility that this was a huge cover-up because it would have looked bad for Hadrian. And what they did was they covered it up so the mob back in Rome who wielded the real power wouldn't get upset. So it was covered up. And he was sidelined. And when I found that, I was like, wow, I can play with this. So I made him like this kind of shifty bastard and who ran when the going got tough. And Karras never knows what happens to him, but I talk about it in a historical note. But it was just one of those things. I went down that rabbit hole on him, and I'm sure you've gone down a lot more than I have. But the history provides a lot of information, and if you take the time to study it, it can be quite fun.
There's some neat bits that come out.
It does. We've been talking about primary sources a lot, and I think something interesting that Marc said just a little bit ago about we don't know what these battles were like because everyone who was reading those kind of already knew. And that's the problem with primary sources. They might be talking about the people were doing this, people were doing that. We don't know what they were wearing because everyone who was reading it knew. That's why secondary sources are so good. Primary sources are wonderful. I've been talking all about Hannibal and stuff, but let me talk about a book I read set in the 9th century, and it was another primary source. It's called An Arab Syrian Gentleman at the Time of the Crusades. This guy was amazing. Every page is full of an anecdote. The time his father was raising hawks, the time he bought a leopard. He mentions casually his friends, the Templars. And here he is, he's a fierce Arab Syrian warrior on the other side, but he just casually mentions he's got some Templar friends. It's a very short book. It's been translated by Philip D. Hiddie, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the original guy's name. It's thin, it's wonderful. Every page has an anecdote. If you come to an anecdote that's not that interesting, wait a page and a half later, there'll be another one. It's just fantastic stories. Women who go to war, you don't think, oh, women didn't go to war at that time. Oh, yeah, they did. And he just casually mentions it, so it's obviously was going on. Yeah, I can't recommend that book highly enough. Just it's overflowing with ideas, and if you see that, it kind of blows your mind to all the other stuff that might be out there in other periods.
Yeah.
Totally. How many people have ever seen Vikings? So the women go to war, right? Shield maidens? That was pretty common back then. Pretty crazy when you think about it.
I get really lucky in the fact that I now live in New Mexico, and even before I did, Lincoln is still there, and it's one of the most well-preserved towns of the West. So when you go there and you step into the Tunstall store, it looks mostly just like it did when Billy sat there by the fire and then saw Brady out the window and said, hey, maybe we should shoot them. I'm not kidding, it wasn't a planned thing. Anyone who reads that and thinks it was a whole planned thing to shoot the sheriff and all of his buddies, no. It was a one of those dumb moments in time when they're like, hey, they're right there, we could it's a long story. You
Were they
want to know more?
drinking?
Ask me. They were not. They'd just barely woken up and were having breakfast. So they probably hadn't enough coffee yet. There are many times that I've walked and felt that moment that they're there with this, someone's there. It was known as the most dangerous street in the country at the time. Like, it's the dangerous one in the world. More people died on that road. You want to be a ghost hunter, go hang out in Lincoln. It'll happen, you'll find something. But for me, I think the most moment I had was that I really felt a connection to Richard Brewer, who's the first leader of the Regulators. Come to find out many years later, my best friend in New York is a descendant of his brother.
Oh, wow.
And we found that only a couple years ago. We were like, oh shit. Sorry. I'm battling ear infection and
Oh,
gross.
bummer.
And so for me, the biggest moment was this. We were trying to find where Richard's buried. And he's on Apache land, and he's near where Glazer's Mill used to be, and that's really not there. There's some rubble, some buildings. But it's not like an actual graveyard you know of unless you know where you're going, and we didn't know where we were going. And my friend pulls him up, and I knew what the picture looked like, and I was like, I know, that just there's a connection. And I turn and I see this tiny bit of a path, and all of a sudden I was like, it's up there. And she's like, how do you know? I was like, I just know. Like, I felt as if someone was pushing me, go, and I just headed up, and I literally walked up, took a right, turned left, I'm like, it's there, and walked straight to his grave. I'd never been there before, but somehow I knew where he was buried, and it was just like a moment. I must have cried. I just sat there and cried. Like, it was my connection to him. There's so much that I don't even know, and it was so real. And my editor of my third book in the series said, hey, I love Billy, he's great, but for some reason, it's Richard that comes through for me so much. And I was like, not really surprising, congratulations, that's kind of the point. I'm like, I did my job. But for me, like, there's a lot of points where I'll just be walking in town, because I go there often, and I'll just touch some of the building, and you just feel. And so, yeah, I'm lucky, that stuff is still there for me, I can still go to it. I can go out in the middle of, I actually learned how to shoot a 6-shooter gun on Tunstall's old property by the person who owns it now. So it is, I'm blessed in the fact that I could go there and experience that and feel that. And so I never take that for granted. And interestingly enough, I lived in New York City when I started this entire set of research, and now I live in Albuquerque. So obviously it was a lot, but for me that's the one thing I can think of that answers your question kind of the way I think you were looking.
For me, you're kind of looking for those magic moments when it resonates. A couple of those. One actually is, doing the rabbit holing, looking for characters. And does anybody know the United States did in fact have an emperor? Does anybody know who that is? Emperor Norton. So in the period where my Blood War Chronicles are set, Emperor Norton he's a whack job, basically. He was
that makes sense.
a lunatic. And the wealthy, the affluent in San Francisco indulged him and let him go about claiming to be Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. And he lived there for quite a while. So in the researches I'm doing for this story, this novel series, I discover Emperor Norton. I'd never heard of this guy before.
I've never heard of it.
Right? And he's an interesting cat. And then as I'm writing this, and I know where my story is going, where the novel's going to head, I realized he is absolutely the perfect guy to be the spy master in this story. And then I did more research. It all worked out. So like I said, there's those really neat moments where you have those. Another one was I was researching for a short story. And over the course of, I found 3 disparate historical events. What is alleged to be one of the largest mass lynchings in Hemp Hill, Texas in 1908. The influenza epidemic of 1917. And then essentially the murder of a white school teacher in Ohio by the Grand Dragoon of the Ku Klux Klan. And in reading through all of this, it occurred to me there's this story of the daughter of one of the men who was lynched becomes a ghost because she died in the, what do you call it, the influenza epidemic. She possesses the soul of the school teacher, and she ends up telling this story of what happened to the school teacher to a reporter. That all really happened. The reporter basically in research, this woman was raped, beaten, and poisoned, and it took her like a month and a half to die. And so a reporter got to her and got this story, and that's why this guy ended up going to jail till the 50s. But it was finding these things where, those moments in history just kind of congeal for stories you want to tell.
Yeah.
It's really a neat experience.
I was going to say there's a really moving comic by Neil Gaiman in the Sandman run about the Emperor Norton. If you guys haven't checked that one out.
He's an interesting cat.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting with the historical fiction of like how you can go, okay, this is maybe not a well-known story, and you can bring it to life because you're bringing it in this person is now very personal because their characterization is here. We can actually give you a lot of information, and it's not because you've ingested so much information, then you can give it very easily. So what are those times, we've talked about the telephone, where you've done hours of research for like a single line, or sometimes to get told, just use matches, please?
I have this exactly. Oh God. In the 5-day battle, when they all arrive in Lincoln, in Coe's book, George Coe wrote a book. It's a little bit sketchy when you read it. He mentions that they took the Torion. Torion is this cylindrical adobe building that was put to fight off Indians. It's the perfect stronghold. McSween owns the land. Booyah, Bob's your uncle. So it makes complete sense that McSween's group would come in and take that for the battle. And you find that out only in one spot, in George Coe's book. However, in every other God-blessed piece of information, the other side has it. And I'm like, well, when did that happen? When did Dolan's group get the upper hand and I can't find it. And all I know is that George Coe says that 5 Mexicans went in, and now I got no 5 Mexicans. And he literally said, that's who took it, and now I'm like, where am I missing the 5 Mexicans at?
There's a story.
There's a story in that. And I literally spent like a month, I was frozen, I couldn't write, I couldn't find them, I couldn't figure it out. I started looking through research if people went missing at that time. And finally this little voice over my shoulder just, you also write fiction. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess so. And so in the end I had to write something fictional with magic that had to take care of the situation that they went missing. And I don't really go into it much. It's a blip because I don't want to, I was like, I don't really know. And I'm just like, But I'm like, well, let's just sketch that out a little. And so it was a moment where I reached out to historians. I was like, hey, Drew Gomber, have you ever watched Young Guns? Anyone ever seen the movie?
Yeah.
At the end of the movie, there's an interview, and that's my buddy, Drew Gomber. And he's an amazing historian of Billy the Kid. In fact, interviews with him changed certain parts of my book. And so, I said to him, it says in this, and he's like, I have no earthly idea. And I was like, well, so I had to use magic and make up stuff and use some fiction. Yeah. So, but the fact that you said that's exactly what happened to me, I lost like a month, y'all. Issues.
No, I got nothing on this one.
I in the Kara saga, Lost Legio 9, when the transition happens from going from our world to Tanis, I had written this really detailed scene about it, and my editorial team got on it, and my agent got on it, and my agent edits all my work. She's freaking awesome. She's a pain in my ass, but she's really good. And they looked at it, and everybody had a different idea as to how to make it go, make it work better. And none of them liked how I did it. So I went ahead and, after listening to all of them, thought really hard. And when you write something as a writer and it comes back, and your editorial team doesn't like it, it's like, oh, you know, it's not a good feeling. And so I threw out about 30 pages that I'd written.
Oh.
And I know it breaks your
Yeah,
heart.
that's I struggle.
And I rewrote it.
Nope.
And how I changed it, and I'm not going to spoil it for those who haven't read it, but basically it was like, it was magic. And then I sent it back out, you know, kind of to the editorial team and my agent, and it was like I was expecting to get all kinds of pushback. And my agent was the first one who read it and wrote me back and went ahead and said, fucking love it. And then my other two developmental editors came back and they were like, it's great. And it's like, oh, okay, I'm done. and I get all this feedback from readers who are like, that whole scene gave me chills. And you know how when Kara, it's just a really cool scene, and it's one of the best scenes that I think I've ever written. But how I had it before, I thought was really good, but in hindsight, it was terrible. And it's also one of the reasons why not only do I have a developmental editing team, I have my agent, but I also have about 25, 30 beta readers, because every once in a while I'll get something back from them that'll be like, I hate this. And it's you as a writer, you want to get that feedback, even though it's painful to you and it's soul crushing because you put so much time and effort into it. You want to get it back because it's an authentic feeling, and you really want to go ahead and get it right for your readers.
Yeah, you do.
I'm good.
All right. Alrighty, we're gonna have just a few questions here. We've got 5 minutes left. If you have any questions, just come up right here and I'll give you the microphone. All right.
You guys have books, right?
And while you're deciding if you have questions and you want to get up to this microphone, which you do, come to the Fantasy Gather tonight
8 p.m.
at 8 p.m. It's till like midnight, and we're going to be selling books there.
Oh,
And
good.
some of us don't want to drag them back across the country.
There is that.
Where's the fantasy?
And some of us
Right
have
above
enough to
us,
give
the
away.
ballroom.
Shush. I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Wah.
All right. So the main
International
question,
South.
the main question I had for each of you, you can just A or B answer. Bounce on a little bit with Billy the Kid shooting, or the center that's gone for 25 years, gap in schedule. But do you prefer working more with the conspiracies that no one believes that just end up being true, or the conspiracies that everyone believes that just happen to be explained by totally mundane events? Just as writers, if you've gone in either of those directions and which you like.
I pretty much just make my own. I mean, because I'm card carrying. I mean, I love conspiracy theories. They're a lot of fun. What I end up doing is take moments and make my own. I get pretty crazy with them.
I created my own conspiracy theory, kind of with mine with Billy, because there's multiple things and people. How I hear people think that Billy the Kid actually died by Pat Garrett. Oh, how many people think that he was not shot by Pat Garrett? Anyone? Okay, see what I mean? So that's the beauty of it, the whole thing. And then I created an alternate one on that myself. So I personally like the idea of taking something that we don't really know the answer to in history and playing with it.
Yeah.
I'm going to do A and B. Sorry. They're both great touch points for ideas. Oh, this could have happened, or this could have happened. You can get several story ideas based off of the same conspiracy theory, depending on what you do with it.
Yeah, I like both. Like, I don't know. It's fun playing with both. Like because I brought a Roman legion. It's like, well, why don't I bring some Greeks? And and I did. So it's
It's a wine on the olive.
yeah, it's a party. You bring some of the Spartans that were at Thermopylae, and it makes it kind of interesting in your story. And then you start bringing other people from history, different parts of history. It's fun.
So, I think we all know that many times truth can be stranger than fiction. So, did you ever, in the course of your research or developing and writing your books, find something that you tried to include, but someone went, "Yeah, just isn't believable, isn't plausible, it breaks reader immersion"? And if so, could you share that with us?
All the time. I'm going to start this one. So I wrote a scene in Tales of the Seventh with Steiger where they attack an enemy camp and overrun it, and it's set in the middle of, and you guys probably read it, and it's set in the middle of a wheat field, and the wheat field catches, Steiger pushes this guy with his shield. He falls into the fire, and his clothes catch on fire, and then he hops up and goes running out in the wheat field, and the wheat field catches fire. And after they attacked this camp because they were short on food and they needed the food, and he just overwhelmed this camp. They took it. They have everything they need, but oh no, the field, the valley is on fire now. They have to run, and they go fleeing, and they hike up out of the valley, and the fire is following them. It's become a forest fire now, and there's this moment where they come on top of a ridge, and they come out of the smoke, and they're hacking and they're coughing and all this stuff, and then it's suddenly like there's an invisible wall there, and they step through it, and it's clear air, and he's like, it's really strange. And I included that in the story, and I had a fan come back and go ahead and say, I used to be a forest firefighter, and that would never happen. Well, it happened to me because when I was a kid in Highlands, North Carolina, and there were forest fires in the area, my brothers and I were hiking, and we were having fun, and there was a forest fire across on the other side of the mountain. At night, you could see the fire, the line, and we were in smoke, and the smoke blew in our direction. We climbed up over this ridge, and it was like we were stepping out of this. There was like an invisible, you could literally put your hand in the smoke and pull it out. It was the craziest thing. And I included it in the story, but I had a fan call me out on it and say, hey, that would never happen. But it did.
I had a not nearly as dramatic a moment when I was writing my Arabian fantasies. There was a sort of version of chess back in the 8th century, and it would have been called shatranj. I don't know how the Arabs would have pronounced it, but the French would pronounce it shatranj.
That accent's like, where do you see my
So in the book, my characters are playing the game, and we're talking about moving the pieces and checkmate and such things, and it came back from the editor, well, this doesn't sound right. Would they be using this terminology? Like, well, yes, this is exactly. And so then he was kind of wanting me to add like a long footnote of explanation or have the characters talk about it in text and explain. It's like, no, they're just playing a game. It's a background detail. Well, you're going to have some people questioning you about whether or not you're depicting this correctly or not. I'm like, I don't care. I don't want to do a, hey, Bob, this is how you play ancient chess. So I just left it as it was.
I had an editor who I first submitted this to, and I respect them very much, and they came back and said, I don't think anyone really wants to read Billy the Kid as a smart protagonist. And I was like, what? And they just thought, I guess their idea of Billy was that, he was this, outlawed, he was dirty and uneducated, and I was like, God, he spoke 3 languages. He was the best singer, dancer. Like, this is not like that, what you're thinking. And the comment they made was, I'm sure you did your research, but, and I was like, I'm not reading any more than this. And all I could think of was like, I stood on his mama's grave and made a promise that I'd write him right. And I'm not going to change it just to sell it to this agent. And so I moved on from there. But yeah, they felt that no one would want to read Billy being the hero and being smart. And I was like, I disagree. And a lot of other people now do too.
For my stuff, really, because I tend to kind of go way off the deep end. I mean, people could, get a career calling me out on that's not accurate. I mean, I have Wild Bill Hickok in my story. Jake Laster killed Wild Wobbling Billy Baru. I make stuff up, and so for me, it was the way I write it. It would be like calling out for something in Army of Darkness. It just wouldn't make any sense.
No chainsaws in Army of Darkness.
Exactly.
You don't open yourself up for as much as like.
Yeah, I never claimed any of this was accurate. It's all a bold-faced lie.
Billy the Kid fans are very particular about their history, and so you have to be ready for all of it. It's a whole different ball.
Yeah.
Anytime you delve into historical fiction,
Oh, yeah,
there
anytime.
are people that think they know more than you, and
And we'll get in your grill about it.
yeah, like I with the Roman, like how they go to war and stuff like that. Like I did my research on it. I got into gear and I had a shield, and when you get hit with a sword on a shield, it's communicated.
It hurts.
Freaking
It
hurts.
hurts.
It's all bruised. And I had a fan come up when I was handing him one of the books, I don't know, a few years ago, and I was like, it's historically accurate. And they were like, well, the Roman legion stabbed, They didn't slash. That better be in there. And I'm like, yeah, it's in there. So,
You're like, okay, buddy.
but they'll call you out on the craziest things, and a lot of times, sometimes they don't know what they're talking about because you've done the research, the homework. Other times they do, and it shocks you.
I know a handful of people that know more.
Alrighty, well, we're gonna have to wrap up here, but thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you
Yes,
all.
thank
We have, well, wait, we have 3 books. If you didn't get one earlier, we have a bunch of free books up here.